guys, welcome back to my channel. Simone here. So today I'm going to be filming my July wrap up, and I read 14 books in the month of July, and I just wanted to really quickly mention that I think this is to do with the fact that I did a TBR for the first time. I'll link my July TBR down below, which I filmed and posted at the end of last month, but I really enjoyed having a TBR and knowing what I was going to read. I felt like it really pushed me to read more, and I definitely think I'm going to continue doing that. In fact, I've just recently published my August TBR, so I'll link that below as well, so you'll see what I'll be reading this month. But like I said, on my July TBR I think there was 12 books. Obviously I read more than that, however there was 3 of those books that do not appear on this list because the first one, The Flame in the Mist, was a library book that was reserved by somebody else, so I had to take it back before I could read it. So that's, I'm afraid I didn't get to read that one, and at the moment I'm not borrowing books from the library, so I'm not going to be getting that back out for a little while at least. The second one is The Wild Truth by Karela, which I am buddy reading with Becky from Beck's Books, whose channel I'll link below, and we haven't finished the buddy read yet, so I'm still in the process of reading that. And then the third one was my random pick of July, which was The Bronze Horseman by Paulina Simons, and I'm currently reading that. I'm about halfway through, so yeah, it's not on this list because I didn't finish reading it in July. But I did read quite a lot of books. I think it helped that I was on holiday for a week of this month, so I actually read quite a bit on holiday. But yeah, let's get started with the books I did read. So the first book that I completed in July was actually one that I started reading in June, and it just finished it in July, and that was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. Now, I'd heard nothing but good things about this book. I've heard the writing was incredible, and I was really excited to read it, but I was a bit sceptical because fantasy is not generally my thing, and depending on what it is will depend on kind of how I feel about it. I did think that Laini Taylor's other book, I've read the first book in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, and I actually quite liked it, but it wasn't a 5-star. However, Strange the Dreamer was 100% a 5-star read from me. I adored this book. This basically follows Laszlo Strange, who is a librarian who was orphaned as a child, I don't think he's ever had parents that he knows of, and he essentially works and lives kind of in this library where he is dreaming of a city called Weep and a place that he knows about, but nobody else is interested in it. And then one day something happens, so he ends up going to the city of Weep, and it's about what happens there. It's about gods, and I really can't explain much else about it because it would spoil it. But I just loved it. I thought it was really well written. I thought the main characters were all really interesting, really complex. I love the side characters. Actually, I think this book is one of those books where the side characters are not just redundant, like they're not just there for the sake of being there, but they give something to the plot, and I adored that. I thought it was great, and yeah, I'm 100% looking forward to reading the second book, The Muse of Nightmares, because I need to know what happens next. If you've read the end of the first one, you'll know. I need to know the next bit. Secondly, I have a book that I said in my July TBR that I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about this, and I was right. This was NW by Zadie Smith, and I've never read a Zadie Smith book before. I own one, and now I'm unsure about how I feel about that book. This book I really didn't like. It was the way it was written. I could probably have got on with the story. It basically follows different people living on a council estate and kind of the things that happen, and it intertwines, and honestly, it's a very long story. It's not really, the book was really short, but it was like a very weird, convoluted storyline. I just didn't like the way it was written. It was the writing style for me. I felt like it was trying too hard, and it was trying to be something that it just didn't make sense. I didn't like any of the characters. They were all really either offensive, horrible, or annoyed me, and yeah, it just wasn't for me. Please let me know if White Teeth is better by Zadie Smith, because if you've read NW, because I've got White Teeth on my shelf, and I do want to read it, but now I'm like, am I gonna like it? The next book on this list is probably the one I was most excited about reading this month, and that is 1984 by George Orwell, which is a sort of just one of the first dystopian novels, and this is a book that I have referenced on this channel loads of times. Like, I always talk about this book and how it's a dystopian, and this is kind of the sort of initial dystopian book and everybody should read it. But I hadn't read it yet, so I've now officially read this book, and I kind of wish I hadn't. I gave this one a 2-star. Oh, I gave NW a 1-star, I never mentioned that. But yeah, the beginning was fine, like, it was okay, it was interesting. Basically, this follows a man named Winston Smith who works for the records department of the Ministry of Truth, which is a place where, basically, the world that he's living in, nobody has their own opinions, I guess. Like, nobody has the right to kind of think differently to different people, and essentially they're told what to think, they're told what to say, they're told what to do, but they kind of all go along with it because it's better than, there's no like crime or anything really, it's not the case. But and essentially what happens every time something happens, the bit that annoyed me to start with, every time something happens, the job of Winston's job as the working in the records department is to change the previous records to make them say what has now happened, so that it always looks like the Ministry of Truth is in control, like, and that they are right, and that they were never wrong. Big Brother was never wrong, he always got the answers right. And like, I don't know, I mean obviously that's the point of the story, is that that could potentially be where we're heading, because the beginning, there are lots of mentions of our potential society, and like saying like when this used to happen, and it's kind of like, oh, that's a little bit weird. What I didn't like about this was about halfway through there is a, what do they call it, like a somebody going up against Big Brother basically and sort of trying to undermine it, and they have produced a manifesto which is given to our main character for some reason. I won't go into detail, like I said, I don't want to spoil it. However, they basically typed the whole entire manifesto out in this book, which I reckon was probably, let's see if I can find it, it was probably like a good 50 pages of just like a manifesto. It was like reading a politician's like political ideas. Like, it was so dry and I really didn't like it, and I just think like, and it was really confusing and kind of all over the place, and to be honest with you, it just didn't sit well with me. I really didn't enjoy it. I found myself just reading it to be finished and to say I'd read it rather than to like, because I was enjoying it. And yeah, this is definitely not for me, I'm afraid, and I'm really sad about it because I really wanted to like this book. Yeah, I didn't like it, I'm afraid. 2-star. The next book I read was a buddy read with Mary from With Cinnamon Please, whose channel I'll link below, and we decided to buddy read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath because we both wanted to read it, and it's quite a short book, so it's not a difficult one to read. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, which I'll try and link below if I can remember which one it was, but I, in that video, said I didn't know how I felt about reading it, because basically The Bell Jar follows a young woman named Esther who is having like suicidal thoughts, and she attempts suicide at least once in this, and it shows how with extreme depression, lots of sort of mental health problems, and as somebody who has suffered from lots of mental health problems and has had suicidal thoughts in the past, in fact quite recently had a bit of a relapse, and so I didn't know how I would feel about this book and how it would affect my mental health. I will say about halfway through this book there was sort of a pivotal moment, and I did have to not read. Like, luckily Mary was so amazingly like, she was really understanding, and I didn't read it for a few days just to kind of get my head back around it. But this was so, I liked the book, I did not like the main character, and this was the discussion that I wanted to have with Mary, and actually we did have it. It was very interesting. Can you dislike a character knowing that part of the reason why you dislike her is probably due to her mental health? It's so difficult to draw the line. Basically, I didn't feel like she was a likeable character. She was very, of course people are now banging next door. Stupid, I'm filming. She was very kind of, what's the word? obsessive at times, very aloof at others. She was quite like back and forward, and I don't know, there was just something about her. She didn't seem to grasp certain things, and actually it really annoyed me, like sometimes the way she treated other people. But then I know that that probably has something to do with her mental health and the way that her mental health was making her feel, making her act towards other people. And so it was really difficult for me to be like, I don't really like the character, when I'm like, actually, am I saying I don't like her because of her bad mental health? So let me know if you've ever thought about that before, because it's an interesting conversation. And I think, like, because sometimes there are just going to be people in life that you just don't like. Now, irrelevant of whether there's mental health or whatever involved, like there are just people that you don't like and don't really want to be around. But how can you distinguish between if you don't like a person and if you don't like what their mental health does to them? Because I'm sure, like, there are times when my mental health makes me into like it changes the way I act around people and changes perhaps my social ability at times. So I can totally relate to her in that way, and actually that's one of the things I loved about this book, was how well I related to her. What I didn't like was the constant random men in her life that were just appearing out of nowhere, and suddenly, like, she was her opinion, not her opinions, but the way that she'd been brought up and her kind of reactions to men and her thoughts and her feelings about different men and different things like that was just very unhealthy for me, and I did not enjoy that part of the book. But yeah, I did enjoy this one. I gave it a 3-star. I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad I read it with Mary, because we did have some interesting discussions about it. So thank you, Mary, if you're watching. And yeah, I think it's one of those that will be interesting to kind of read more of Sylvia Plath, because I think that book was partly biographical. Like, I think she'd autobiographical. I think she'd has experienced some of those things. So it definitely was interesting, and I thought the mental health explanations in it were really, really good. Then the next book I read, I'm really excited to talk about, and that is The Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second book in the Six of Crows duology. I read The Six of Crows 2017, it was my favourite book of the year, and I was kind of a bit nervous to read Crooked Kingdom because I loved the first one so much, and I didn't have anything to be worried about. I gave this one a 5-star. I actually think I might have preferred it slightly to Six of Crows. At the beginning I was a bit like, oh, I'm not sure I'm liking this, because it is a bit slow to start, but I think it's just kind of, it's that whole getting you back up to speed with what's going on and kind of explaining what's happening and getting you kind of like set up with it. But the rest of it was amazing. I thought it was really well told. The relationships were amazing. One of the characters in the whole, I won't say who, something happens to one of the characters at the end, and I've never cried so much in my whole life. It was literally heartbreaking. And I was literally like, anybody else apart from this person, because they're like my favourite. I did want to punch Kaz in the face a couple of times though. Like, I was like, come on, wake up. Like, you're not understanding this. So yeah, I loved this. I really loved it. I'm really glad I read it, and I'm glad I didn't put it off any further, because I know I was sort of like, oh, I don't want to read the second one in case it spoils the first one for me, but it definitely didn't do that. And if you've read the first one and you're not sure, please do continue, because I think you'll love it just the same or even more. The next book I read was Just One Day by Gail Forman. This follows a girl named Alison who goes on a, like, it's not around the world, but it's like a, is it a European tour with her friend and a group of people that she doesn't know, with this sort of tour company after her exams, and she didn't get to go to Paris. I think there was some problem for some reason. Anyway, she meets, just on sort of the last few days of the tour, they actually get lost from the tour guide, and they meet a boy who she sort of has an attraction to immediately, and a kind of like, they spark up a bit of an interesting rapport. And he says, why don't you come to Paris with me for one day? For 24 hours, she arranges to meet her friend back in the airport the next day, and it's kind of about that 24 hours, about her getting to know this guy and kind of what happens. What I didn't expect, this was only, I think only like the first half of this, possibly. So like maybe the first like half was actually about the day in Paris. The rest is kind of about the aftermath and things that happen, and it goes on to like a year or two later. And I actually really did enjoy that aspect of it. I was thinking if it was just going to be the one day, firstly that's super insta-lovey, like if it was going to be like a romance story about one day, but it wasn't like that. And obviously it talked about later on, and there was brilliant friendships in this, and I loved the idea of kind of, and one of the things I loved about this, so when she, about the kind of later bit, when after the initial day in Paris, then the main character Alison goes to college or university. I don't know exactly which one it is because it's American, I believe. So yeah, anyway, she goes off to college, and what I loved most about this was the way that it talked about college. I went to university in 2010, and I was there for 3 years in the same way that she was, and she talked about kind of the people around her and how she didn't necessarily connect to those people so much, and it was about her missing home but not missing home, and I totally felt like she understood where I was going with it. What I didn't like about this book was it felt kind of bitty in places. Like, I didn't feel like it totally explained itself. I did feel like some of the conversations that were had between the main characters were a little bit like odd. They didn't quite work, and I just, some of it didn't sit very well with me, but most of it was really good. And I gave this book a 3 stars. I definitely would continue with the series. I think the next one's called what is the next one? Like Just One Year? I don't know. I'm interested to read the next one though and see kind of where it goes. Then the next book I have talked about a lot on this channel already. I mentioned it in my July favourites, so, and it was my favourite book of the month. And I won't talk about it too much because I don't want to kind of rehash old things. I don't want to talk about it again and again and again. But this is The Disappearance of Emily Maher by Louise Candlish, which follows a woman named Tabby who spots another woman standing outside of what she thinks is a holiday home on an island off the coast of France, and she is reciting the entrance code to get into the flat. Then when Tabby sees the woman a bit later on carrying a bag, she assumes she's going home, and so Tabby lets herself into this flat, and then the woman finds her in her bed. And there is a lot of mental health representation in this, which I really enjoyed. There's massive twists and turns. You hear about both women's lives. This story is told from the perspective of Tabby in the present day, and about kind of what led her to, it was kind of what led her to be here, but it's mainly about what's actually happening now. And then you have the character Emmy, who has written like a diary type thing from maybe 2 years previous, and it's kind of how she got there in the first place. And Tabby learns certain things about Emmy and tries to help her out, and it's kind of about what happens there. It's a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it, and I don't hear anybody talking about it, and I'm really sad about that because I think more people should read this because they would like it a lot. Like I said, the mental health representation in this was amazing, and it's not something I didn't get what was coming. Like, I didn't predict it. It was totally unpredictable. Very likeable characters in this, even though some of them were doing terrible things, but I still really liked them. And yeah, it gave me that like feeling of kind of like, you know kind of what's you feel like you know what's gonna happen, then it does, and it goes off on a different tangent, and you think, oh my god, I didn't see that. Like, yeah, I really liked this one though. Next up we have To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han. This was a book that has been talked about quite a lot, and I believe there's a film coming out of this. It might even be in August, like it might be coming out as this video goes up, I'm not entirely sure. I do want to watch the film now because this book was really interesting. This follows a Korean American girl named Lara Jean Song who lives with her 2 sisters and her father after her mother died. And she has had crushes on like 5 boys before, and whenever she kind of gets out of that and stops kind of having, not necessarily stops having a crush on them, but kind of moves on again, I guess, she writes a letter to each one of these people, and she keeps it in a hat box in her cupboard. And one day they get sent out, and she then has to deal with the consequences of that. She's also dealing with the fact, obviously, that her family is, I think her father is American and her mother was Korean, and so because her mother has died, she's also kind of not missing a whole section, but that side of her identity is kind of more difficult to get to. So it does talk about like how at Thanksgiving they have to like make certain Korean things, and they're trying to keep that identity alive. She's also in here talking about the fact that her older sister is going away to university, and she's being left in charge at home basically and looking after her younger sister. And I really liked this book, but there were certain elements to it that I found to be a little bit sort of, not childish, but just a bit more juvenile. And there's one trope in this which I won't go into because it really is a bit of a spoiler, but the trope in it is something that I really don't like in books, and I don't like reading about it. So I didn't totally love this for that reason. I did think it was an interesting read, and I did give it 3 stars, and I do think I will continue with the series and I will watch the film. I loved the fact that it was, I think it was the first book I've read about a Korean main character actually, and I would love to read more because the culture, they didn't talk much about the culture, but the bits that they did mention were quite interesting. So yeah, I would love to, please give me recommendations of Korean characters and books, because I'm really, really interested to read more about that. The next book I have is This Lullaby by Sarah Dessen, and this follows what was her name? This follows a character named Remy whose father has passed away, and all she has to remember him is a song that he wrote, because he was a musician, with the line in it, I will let you down. Unfortunately for her, that song is like really famous, and so she hears all the time because it's kind of like the one-hit wonder from her father. And then she kind of has sworn herself off of musicians in the future, and then she meets Dexter, who kind of literally bounces into her life. And she's kind of, like I said, sworn off him. She was musicians in general and doesn't want to entertain it, but she finds herself more and more drawn to him and more breaking the rules that she made herself. I did not enjoy this book necessarily. I gave this book a 2-star. I read this on holiday, and I kept reading because I didn't have any other book to read at that point, so otherwise I probably would have put it down. I can see the good things in this. One of the things I did love about this book was that the main character, Remy, smokes, drinks and sleeps around and is not ashamed of that. She is happily doing what she wants to do. And actually I found that to be really refreshing. I don't read many books where the main character like is anything other than like angel or like perfect, or like maybe they're a bit sassy, but that's about as far as you really get. This was really, really interesting to see a completely different side of a main character, and that's about where it stopped with my enjoyment. Basically, I felt like Dexter was very pushy and was essentially forcing himself on her. I felt like she was too aloof, and I didn't enjoy that side of her, and kind of the way that she sort of dismissed him really annoyed me. And to be honest with you, there was what I felt like was kind of like girl hate in this. Basically, she has 3 best friends. 2 of them hate each other, or at least it comes across in that way. One of them like mocks the other one for being overweight and calls her names and like tells her she shouldn't eat things and whatever, which I hate in books. And the one that is overweight and mocks the other one because her mum is an air hostess and buys her lots of like expensive things, and kind of mocks her for her wealth and the way that she like has everything she needs, like, and how she says she's spoiled. And I'm like, do we need girl hate in books? Like, does that have to be a thing? Because I really despise it, and I just felt like the storyline was ridiculous, and yeah, I didn't like it at all. Like I said, I gave it a 2-star. I could see the merits in part of it, but the girl hate, I just couldn't get over it. So I would like to read another Sarah Dessen book because I hear so many people talking about her books, but this one was just not one for me. So maybe I'll read a different one and hope that I'll like it more, but this one was not a fan of. Then the next one I have is actually a book that my mum took on holiday and was reading it, and then she finished it and I'd finished my books, and I thought, I don't have a book to read, I've run out. So I read her book instead. So the next one I have is Give Me the Child by Mel McGrath, which is not a book I'd even heard about before, but actually I quite liked this book. I did give this book a 3-star. This follows a character named Caitlin, who is a doctor, and her speciality is child psychopathy, and so she spends a lot of time going into that. Now one evening her and her husband Tom are at home with their daughter Freya, and they're all in bed, and it's sort of like, I think it's like 2 AM even, and there is a knock on the door, and it is a police officer with a young girl named Ruby Winter, who basically comes and says that Ruby's mother is dead. Ruby is actually Tom's daughter, and the sad thing is Ruby and Freya are the same age, because basically when Caitlin gave birth to Freya, or was in the hospital, she had, I can't remember the exact term for it, but basically it's where she has like a, what do they call it, like a psychotic episode, maybe. Basically the pregnancy caused her to have some mental health problems, and she had kind of like a breakdown, and she was a little bit psychotic for a while. I think that's the term. I'm sorry if that's not what you're supposed to say and how you meant to use it, but she had this breakdown basically, and while she was in the hospital, Tom, this was over a period of time, not just the day, but Tom found solace in this other woman, and unfortunately for them, well, not unfortunately necessarily, but basically Ruby was born, and so they show up and say, here's your daughter, her mum's dead, she's got nowhere else to go. And it's a case of Caitlin firstly hates the fact that her husband has cheated on her, and secondly the fact that this girl is now here, but she kind of feels bad for the girl and kind of lets her stay in the house. Anyway, long story short, there's something happens, and it is like there are just things happening throughout this that just are amazingly complex and all over the place, and lots of things happening. There was again a massive mental health representation in this. This was kind of that whole, like, if you've had a mental episode in the past, like a bad negative mental episode, like will you ever be taken at your word again, or will you kind of be looked at as if, oh, she's probably just mad? And that made me feel sick while reading this. I just wanted to just shake people and be like, look, this is what's actually happening. Like, don't, like, I hated the way that they could use that against her. And yeah, really, really enjoyed this. I actually am really surprised I loved it so much, because like I said, this was not a book I'd even heard about before, but my mum was reading it and I was like, oh, I'll read that after you because I have nothing else to read. And yeah, I think I read this in like 2 days. I read this on the bus home from our holiday, and then I sat, when I got back to my house, it was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and I think I read the rest of it in like 2 hours. So yeah, really, really enjoyed this one. Like I said, I gave it a 3. It wasn't perfect, but I did actually really enjoy it. I forgot, I actually had another one that my mum gave me to read while we were on holiday as well, because again, I only took 3 books with me thinking that would be fine, and then I read them really, really quickly, so I had to keep borrowing books from her. But that is Can I Let You Go by Kathy Glass. Now, Kathy Glass is a foster mother, is that what they call them? She's a foster parent, and she writes under a pseudonym. Obviously Kathy Glass is not her real name, but she writes books about the children that she fosters. The difference in this book is that she's actually fostering an adult who is 21 years old, a woman named Faye, not her real name obviously, and Faye has severe learning difficulties, but she's pregnant. And so Kathy, the initial intention is that she is fostering Faye until she has the baby, and then she can go back and live with her grandparents because they can't look after her while she's pregnant, because they're quite elderly and not very mobile. However, a little bit into this, Faye decides that she might actually want to keep the baby, and so she has to sort of learn how to parent, and then she's going to go to a baby mother centre to basically learn how to look after the baby, and then they'll decide whether she can keep it or not. This was a lovely story. I think if you enjoy, or you would like to read these types of books, I've read quite a few of Kathy Glass's books before, not all of them quite as happy as this one. I do also think that this is more, this one is not about child abuse. Now, a lot of the cases that Kathy has, the children that she fosters have been abused, or that's kind of the reason why they've been fostered on. Not all of them, but some of them. This one is not one of those. So if you want to read more like a book about a foster carer, but you don't want to read about child abuse, this is perhaps a good one to read, because like I said, it's not about child abuse. It was a really beautiful story. I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad that my mum had this so I could read this on holiday. The next book is the next one to my Stand Up to the TBR, and I'll link that video below. But this one was Another Day in the Death of America by Gary Young, and this is where Gary Young has picked a random day in America. I believe it was November the 23rd of 2015. I might have just made that up. It's a Saturday. Anyway, and he just picked a random day in America, and unfortunately, because of the way America the way the gun crime is there, 10 children and young adults were killed by gun violence on this particular day. And he goes into each one of those cases and talks about what happened and what lessons we can learn from that and how we can deal with it. And also the fact that because there are so many gun deaths in America, they're often missed out of kind of mainstream news, I guess. Like, people don't talk about them because it's just like a byproduct of being in America, which is terribly sad, and also is a little bit scary, I won't lie. This was really hard-hitting, this story. I did give this one a 3-star. Oh, I gave Can I Let You Go a 4-star, by the way. I should have just mentioned that. I really enjoyed reading about this topic. When I say enjoyed, obviously it's a horrible topic to read about, but in terms of it was really fascinating to me and I learnt a lot from it. I do often feel with non-fiction that they can feel a bit textbooky at times, and I did feel like this sort of fell into that trap a little bit. But obviously there are certain things that had to be sort of talked about in that way. So yeah, I gave this a 3-star. I really did enjoy it. I would like to read more books about this type of topic. So please, recommendations. I love non-fiction books and I'm trying to read a few more of them soon. So yeah, I did enjoy this. I'm glad that the stand up to the TBR got me to read this one because I did enjoy reading it quite a lot. The next book I have is not a surprise to anybody. I've read this book a million times, probably. And that is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. This is a huge book. I did not read it all this month. I'm listening to the audiobook of this, or I was listening to the audiobook of this, and I just managed to finish it right at the end of the month. I thought, oh, am I going to get this one in? And I did. I love the Order of the Phoenix. It's one of my favourites. I know some people don't like it because Harry, his personality is a bit darker in this, and that he has kind of, he feels like everyone's against him. But I actually really enjoy that. I think it's kind of a nod to the general teenager. Like, this happens to people, this is the way people sometimes are, and I really did enjoy that. I think this was really well written. Obviously it's J.K. Rowling, I love it, and I just like this one. I'm obviously very sad about the end, but I think that this book has the best characters in. I really like the relationship between Harry and Sirius, and I don't enjoy necessarily the sceptical side of the relationship between Ron and Harry and generally the rest of them. But I think it kind of all works out in the end, so yeah, I'm a fan of this one. And then the final book that I read in the month of July was Karela by Ashley Poston, and this book was amazing. I gave this book a 5-star. I also gave Harry Potter a 5-star, obviously. Do you know what? I read this and at the beginning I was a bit like, I don't know, this is just a bit weird. This is basically a loose Cinderella retelling set around the universe of kind of cosplay and fandoms. It follows a main character, Elle, who loves the fandom of, is it Starfield, and she, her father died. Oh well, can we see the Cinderella thing there? Her father died, and he had this big cosplay convention he sort of set up called Excelsior, and he obviously died. She was left with her stepmother and 2 stepsisters. Yes, I know, we can see the parallels. And then there's going to be a Starfield remake, and it's like a kind of like Star Wars, I guess, or like Star Trek. And she's kind of obsessed with this series, and then there's going to be a remake, and the main character has been recast as Darian Freeman, who she does not like. And yeah, it's kind of about that. She decides that she's going to go to this cosplay event and she's going to dress up and kind of try to emulate her father. And yeah, and I liked this because I felt like when I was reading it, I did feel like I was basically reading a Cinderella story. If you've seen the movie A Cinderella Story with Hilary Duff, it's one of my favourite movies of all time, and it literally feels like I'm reading it with this, because for some reason everything I sort of read, this made sense, like everything. I felt like Sage was Wanda, and I just adored it, absolutely adored it. I'm so glad that I read this. I'm really glad I got this. I found this in the library just after it came out last year, and it was like £1, but I didn't actually read it then, and I've read it now and I'm so glad I did. And it ended my month of July off really well because, like I said, I really adored this book. So that was the 14 books I read this month. I'm really sorry, I know this video is going to be really long. I feel like I've been talking for ages. But yeah, so hopefully you like this video. Give this video a thumbs up if you did. I upload new videos every Monday and Friday at 5 PM. Please come back and watch more things when I upload. And yeah, I'd love to chat to you in the comments below. Bye guys.